You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws crumbled, only one rule remains. Break it, and you're cast into digital oblivion. The rule? Subscribe and hit that like button. We hit 11,000 souls, but we're hungry for more. Next stop, 100,000 before 2027. We're also on Spotify now and Devoid of Fears if you want fewer ads or to listen with your phone off. So subscribe, like, and let's take over every platform out there. Now let's dive into today's story. There is a hill about 50 miles southwest of Paris where people have been coming to pray for longer than prayer has had a name. Before the Cathedral, before the church that burned before it, and the church before that. Before Christianity reached that part of Gaul with its crosses and its doctrine, and its insistence that whatever had always been holy about that place was holy for entirely different reasons than anyone had previously believed. The Carnutes, a Celtic tribe whose territory spanned the region around modern-day Chartres, had been gathering on that hill since before Julius Caesar was born. Every year, druids from every corner of Gaul would make the journey to the Carnute sacred grove, because the Carnutes held the most important sanctuary in all of Gaul, the ritual centre of their entire world, the geographic and spiritual heart of their people. Caesar mentions it in his account of the Gallic Wars, not because he found it impressive, but because he found it inconvenient. When you are trying to conquer a people, their holy places are a problem. The Druids believed that energy rose from the earth at that hill, not as metaphor, as literal physical fact. They believed the ground breathed there. They had built their sacred grotto directly over a well that went down more than 100 feet into the dark, and the water in that well was said to have the kind of power that medicine couldn't explain and couldn't replicate. People with diseases that had not responded to anything else would come from hundreds of miles away and be lowered into that well on ropes, and some of them, enough of them, came back up changed. Caesar burned their groves and killed their priests and outlawed their rituals. The Romans built a temple to their own gods on the hill. The Christians came after the Romans and built a basilica on top of what remained of the temple. The basilica burned. Another church rose, that burned too. The site was struck by fire and war and age 5 separate times over 600 years, and each time something was rebuilt on that same hill, over that same well, facing the same direction, using the same basic proportions. In the year 1100, the bishop of the diocese had the ancient well filled in with rubble and mortar. A wall was constructed across the entrance to the grotto, where the Druids had once performed their rites. The official record states that this was done for structural reasons, to stabilise the foundation for the new cathedral that was about to be built above it. In 1128, construction of St. Aldamar's Cathedral began. I want you to hold that sequence of events in your mind for the rest of this story, because understanding what happened to Lucien Pharaoh requires understanding that everything that occurred in that building over the following 900 years was a consequence of a decision made by someone who is long dead and left no explanation for why they did what they did. The well was filled in, the grotto was sealed, the cathedral was built above it, and whatever the Carnutes had been coming to that hill for 2,000 years to stand near was, for 9 centuries, pressed beneath 100,000 tons of stone. Lucien was 43 years old when he was hired to lead the restoration of St. Aldamar's. He was a preservation architect, which is a specific and particular kind of person. Not a designer, not a builder, not an engineer exactly, though a restoration architect needs to understand all of those things. A preservation architect is someone whose job is to take a damaged historical structure and return it to what it was. Not what it might have been, not an interpretation of its original intent. What it actually was, exactly as it was, with every measurement verified and every material matched. and every proportion restored to its original specification. It requires the patience of a monk and the precision of a surgeon, and a particular philosophy about the relationship between the present and the past. Lucien had that philosophy in his bones. He believed, with the kind of quiet conviction that doesn't need to announce itself, that the past had a right to be remembered accurately, that the things human beings had built over centuries deserved to be understood on their own terms, not through the lens of whoever happened to be restoring them. He had turned down commissions that would have required him to make interpretive decisions, to fill gaps in the record with educated guesses. If he couldn't verify it, he wouldn't put it back. This made him slow and meticulous, and expensive and, in the very specific world of historical preservation, irreplaceable. When Lucien arrived at St. Aldemars in the spring, what he found was a building that had survived 4 years of hasty repairs after a partial collapse in the 1960s and had not recovered. The wrong stone had been used in the western wall reconstruction, limestone where the original was sandstone, close enough in colour that the surveyors of the time had signed off on it, wrong enough in composition that Lucien could tell the difference from 20 feet away. The mortar was the wrong ratio. The load-bearing elements of the collapsed section had been shored up with steel reinforcement that was not visible from outside, but that had quietly and inexorably altered the way the building's weight moved through its structure over the following 60 years. St. Aldemars was standing. It was not whole. His first act, before he hired anyone or filed any permits, was to spend 3 days alone in the building with the original plans, which had been discovered in a monastery library 2 hours to the north, photographed, digitized and sent to him 6 months earlier. He walked every inch of the structure with those plans in his hands, checking dimensions, tracing load paths, trying to understand the mind of whoever had designed this building in 1128. And the building's design was unusual. Lucien had worked on Romanesque structures across France and Germany, and twice in England, and he knew the conventions of the period. The thick walls, the rounded arches, the barrel vaults that gave those churches their excellent acoustics and their profound darkness. The standard cross plan of nave and transept and chancel that oriented the building toward heaven. St. Aldemars followed all of those conventions on its surface, but beneath the conventions, something about its geometry was different. The foundation walls were substantially thicker than load-bearing calculations required. Not just thick in the way of cautious Romanesque builders who understood that stone was heavy and the earth was uncertain, but thick in a way that served no obvious structural purpose. The crossing tower, which in standard Romanesque design sits at the intersection of nave and transept, was offset by roughly 4 feet from where it should have been, positioned in a way that made no aesthetic sense and no structural sense, as though its placement was determined by something other than the logic of the building itself. And the crypt, which Lucien spent an entire afternoon in, was laid out with a specificity he couldn't fully explain. The dimensions of each section, the angle at which the main gallery met the apse, the way the floor sloped, almost imperceptibly, toward the northwest corner. Not the result of settling, not any imperfection in the original construction. Deliberate. He noted all of it. He filed it in the part of his mind labelled for later, the part that held things that didn't yet have an explanation, and he got on with the work. His team arrived in stages over the following 2 weeks. Elias Varga came first, driving down from Budapest, in a truck that was older than the project and better maintained. Elias was 56 and had been working stone since he was 19 years old, starting as an apprentice in Hungary and following the great restoration projects across Europe as they came available. He was not educated in the academic sense, had no university credentials, and had never needed them. What he had instead was 37 years of direct experience with old stone. He could look at a wall and tell you within a decade when it had been built. He could press his palm against the surface and feel the difference between stone that had been quarried in limestone country and stone that had come from granite. He had, over the course of his career, developed what he called an understanding of old buildings, a phrase he used without embarrassment and without explanation because, in his experience, the people who didn't understand what he meant weren't the kind of people whose opinion he needed. He and Lucien had worked together 3 times before. Their collaboration had a particular dynamic. Lucien would identify what needed to be done, and Elias would figure out how to do it in a way that honoured the original work. They were not close friends. They were something rarer, 2 very different people who trusted each other completely inside the boundaries of the work. Caris Llewellyn arrived a week after Elias. She was 34, Welsh, the youngest senior member of the team by nearly a decade, and she had a way of looking at ancient structures that was entirely her own. Her specialty was monitoring, watching buildings for the subtle signs of distress that precede catastrophic failure, which in old structures often presented as movements so small they required instruments to detect. She had spent 3 years developing her own sensor array, small wireless units that could be embedded in foundation walls and bedrock, capable of detecting displacement in the range of fractions of a millimeter. She was going to use St. Aldemars as a live case study. She had a quiet, methodical manner that reminded Lucien of himself at a younger age, and she had a thing she did when she was thinking that he found slightly unnerving. She went absolutely still, not the stillness of someone who has paused, but the stillness of someone in whom motion has temporarily ceased to be an option, and she stayed that way until the thought was finished. Matteo Serrano came from Seville, arriving with 2 hard-sided cases of equipment and an expression of barely contained anticipation. He was 47, with a specialist's narrow focus and a craftsman's love for the physical reality of his subject. Matteo restored frescoes. Medieval wall paintings were his particular devotion, and he approached them the way a surgeon approaches a patient, with complete attention, complete respect, and the knowledge that the difference between care and carelessness was the difference between survival and loss. He had grown up in a city full of churches whose painted interiors had been whitewashed over during the Reformation or plastered across during subsequent renovations, and he had spent his adult life finding what was underneath. He knew the signs better than almost anyone. The slight flatness when new plaster had been applied over old, the way a repainted surface breathed differently from an original. He had an almost supernatural instinct for where hidden images were likely to be. And then there was Olivier Bascom, who was 63 and French, and who occupied a different category from the others. Olivier had not been hired by Lucien. Olivier came with the building. He had been the cathedral's bellkeeper for 30 years, longer than the restoration project had been conceived of, longer than Lucien had been in the profession. He maintained the bells, serviced the mechanism, kept the ropes in condition, and knew every sound the building made with the intimacy of someone who had been listening to it for 3 decades. He lived 20 minutes away in the same house he had grown up in, and he came to the cathedral most mornings without being asked, the way some people return to a place out of habit so deep it has become indistinguishable from love. He was not a talker. He answered questions with the minimum number of words that would adequately serve the answer. And he had a way of watching the restoration work in progress that felt less like curiosity and more like vigilance. The first time Lucien tried to make conversation with him, Olivier listened politely for a while and then said, in French, that he was more interested in how the building sounded than in how it looked, and went back to what he had been doing before. Lucien took no offence. He understood the sentiment completely. The work began. The first year was largely diagnostic. Survey, sample, catalogue, plan. Lucien's restoration projects always started this way. He would not put a single new stone into a building until he understood everything about the building. he was putting it into. He spent months cross-referencing the original plans with the physical structure, reconciling discrepancies, understanding what had changed and why, and in what sequence. He sent stone samples to a geology lab for mineral composition analysis. He had the mortar analysed and formulated an equivalent mixture that would behave the same way under load. He documented every carved element in the building in photographs and three-dimensional scans, because when the time came to restore the damaged carvings, he wanted to work from an exact record of what had existed, not from his own aesthetic judgment about what should have existed. Elias spent the first year doing what he always did at the start, learning the stone. He visited every quarry within 100 kilometers that could have supplied material of the right composition, and walked through all of them, looking and touching, comparing samples against the material already in the building. He found his match at a quarry about 60 kilometers to the east, the same quarry, based on the mineral analysis that had supplied the original 1128 material. The quarry operator was surprised and slightly baffled by how specific Elias's requirements were. Elias explained patiently that he was not looking for stone that was close. He was looking for the same stone. The operator eventually understood, or decided to act as though he did, and Elias found what he needed. Caris spent the first year installing her sensors and establishing baseline readings. She embedded them in the foundation walls at 12 locations, in the bedrock at 3 anchor points below the crypt floor, and in the ground at 4 external positions around the building's perimeter. Then she watched. The readings were exactly what she expected for an old building being carefully disturbed by restoration work. Micro-settling in the areas being actively worked. Slight compression in the foundation walls near the scaffolding. The kind of gentle breathing that ancient stone does when you give it attention after years of neglect. She logged everything and found nothing alarming. Matteo spent the first year on the upper registers of the nave walls, cleaning and consolidating what was already visible. The frescoes at St. Aldamar's were in better condition than most of what he usually worked on. The Romanesque barrel vault that covered the nave, with its thick stone and minimal windows, had created a relatively stable environment for the painted surfaces. Less light, less temperature variation, less moisture ingress than in buildings that had been opened up by Gothic reconstruction in later centuries. He worked methodically from west to east, starting at the entrance and moving toward the choir, documenting each section before touching it and working slowly enough that he had time to notice things. It was in the second year, on a cold morning in March, working on a section of the south nave wall, about 2/3 of the way toward the crossing, that Matteo found what he found. He had been cleaning the painted surface of a large Annunciation scene, the angel appearing to Mary, rendered in the standard Romanesque style of flattened perspective and symbolic gesture that he found beautiful in the way that absolute clarity is beautiful. The work was going well, and then beneath his cleaning cloth, in a section of wall that he had just treated, and that should have revealed the original paint surface underneath the centuries of grime, he found flatness. A preservation specialist learns to read walls the way other people read faces. The texture of an original medieval plaster surface is specific, slightly rough at the microscopic level, the marks of the tools still present, even after 8 centuries, the paint layer sitting on top of the plaster in a way that produces a particular quality of light. What Matteo found instead was the flatness of new plaster applied over something older, a smoothness that erased all the detail, the specific blankness of a covering. Someone had plastered over this section of wall at some point after the original painting was completed. Not weather damage, not water seepage, a deliberate act. He took out a probe, thin as a needle, and pressed it gently into the surface at an angle. He felt it meet resistance at a depth of about 2 centimeters, the resistance of a plaster layer below the outer one, and then the softer resistance of what was beneath that, which he knew from long experience was paint, original paint. sealed under the covering layer in whatever condition it happened to be in when the plaster went over it, which if the covering layer was thick enough and well applied might be remarkably good condition. He did not say anything to Lucien that morning. He told himself he wanted to understand what he was dealing with before he said anything. He told himself he would have a clearer picture in a few days. In a few days he had a clearer picture and he still said nothing. What he uncovered, working each morning before anyone else arrived, removing the covering layer one careful square centimetre at a time, was the oldest painting in the cathedral. Not the Annunciation that had been painted on top of it. What was underneath had been there since the building was new, painted on the original plaster by whoever had painted the rest of the nave walls in the years following 1128. The colours were extraordinary. The red ochre was deep and clear, the bone white crisp, the dark outline work unwavered by age, sealed in the dark behind the covering layer for somewhere between 500 and 800 years. It had been protected from the light and the air that slowly destroyed everything that stayed exposed. It took Matteo 2 weeks to understand what he was looking at. The image was the cathedral. He recognized it immediately. The proportions of the nave, the distinctive offset crossing tower, the specific arrangement of the arcade columns that he had been staring at every day for over a year. It was St. Aldamar's, rendered with the specific knowledge of someone who knew every stone. But it was not being built in any way that made sense for a cathedral. In the image, the workers were facing downward. They were carrying stone not upward toward the rising walls, but downward, into the earth, into a space below ground level that the image depicted in careful detail. Their faces, when Matteo got the grime fully off and could see them properly, were arranged in an expression he'd spent a long time trying to categorize before he gave up trying to categorize it and simply acknowledged what it was. Not devotion, not craftsmanship, not the focused quiet of people doing difficult work. Fear. They were afraid of what they were building toward. And in the lowest register of the image, below the foundation line, depicted with the same care and the same specific knowledge that the artist had brought to the rest of the painting, was a form in the earth below the building. Lucien will tell you, if you ask him, that he has never in his life been comfortable describing what that figure looked like. Not because it was monstrous exactly, but because the image of something very large and entirely still communicates information about scale and patience that stays with you. It was curled the way animals curl when they are deeply asleep, the way the body does when it has surrendered completely to unconsciousness. It was enormous. It was beneath the building, the way a root system is beneath a tree, present in every direction, the building above it as much a consequence of it as a covering. Matteo photographed everything. He wrote a careful, thorough report. He put the photographs in a folder on his laptop and he put the report in the same folder, and he closed the folder, and he told himself every morning for 4 months that he would show Lucien when the project was over. He could not have told you with certainty why he waited. He will tell you now that he was afraid, not of what the image meant, but of what would happen if he showed it to someone who had the authority to stop the work. 4 years, Lucien's 4 years. The years of everyone on the team. The building itself, finally, after 6 decades of wrong stone and bad mortar, being given back what it had lost. He told himself the image was symbolic. He told himself a great many things. 3 months after Matteo found the hidden fresco, Caris found the movement. She noticed it on a Thursday morning in August, when she opened her monitoring software with coffee in hand and saw that the sensor readings from the previous 48 hours were different in a way she had never encountered in a foundation study. The sensors were registering displacement, not the random, micro-settlings she'd been logging for years. Directional movement, consistent across all 12 foundation sensors simultaneously, a slow clockwise rotation of the entire foundation mass. Not millimeters, fractions of millimeters, but consistent, and when she plotted it across the 48 hours, slightly accelerating. She ran diagnostics for 2 hours. She recalibrated the sensors and waited another 24 hours and checked again. The movement was still there, slightly larger than before. She called the manufacturer of the sensor array, a Finnish company whose technical support line she had called 3 times over the previous 3 years for issues that turned out to be user error. She was not calling about user error this time, and she knew it, but she went through the entire diagnostic checklist with the technician anyway. When they finished, the technician paused and then said carefully that there was no equipment explanation for the readings she was describing, and asked whether there was any geological activity in the area that might account for subsidence. She knew there was not. She had checked the geological surveys before she started the project. She thanked the technician and hung up, and sat looking at the numbers for a long time. The foundation of St. Aldamar's Cathedral was rotating, slowly, smoothly, consistently. The entire foundation mass of a 900-year-old building was turning like a wheel, as though something beneath it was also turning, as though the building sat on top of something vast and gradually waking. Caris did not tell Lucien. She told herself there had to be a geological explanation she hadn't found yet. She told herself this every morning for the following 6 weeks, and every morning the numbers were slightly larger than the morning before. Elias said nothing to anyone, but Elias was not hiding anything. Elias simply had no framework in which to report what he was experiencing in any way that would be accepted. He had first noticed it in October of the 3rd year, working on the lowest courses of the western wall, where the new and original material met at the foundation level. He had been placing his hands on stone surfaces for 37 years. He knew everything those surfaces could tell him. Temperature, age the way recently worked. Stone felt different from stone that had been untouched for centuries. The specific warmth the sunlight stored in exposed surfaces and released slowly after dark. What he felt in those lowest stones had no precedent in his experience. They were warm, not from sunlight which never reached that deep into the interior of the building, not from any mechanical source, a deep, dry warmth, steady as a held breath, close to body temperature, as though something had been resting its hands on those stones from the other side for a very long time. He checked other sections of the foundation, working his way around the perimeter over the following weeks. The warmth was not uniform. It was strongest in the northwest corner. It radiated outward from there with decreasing intensity, the way heat radiates from a source. He pressed his palm flat against the lowest stone in the northwest corner one morning in November and stood there for a full minute, feeling the warmth move through his skin, and he thought about what he knew about old buildings and memory, about the things that stone can hold, and he did not find any comfortable thought at the end of that line of thinking. He did not tell Lucien. He had the language for it, but not the confidence that the language would be understood. The completion ceremony was held on a Friday afternoon in late November, the sky above the cathedral deep blue in the way of old stone and winter light. Lucien had spent the final 2 weeks verifying every section of the restoration against the original plans. He walked the building with a kind of controlled emotion that he recognized from the end of previous projects, but that felt different this time, bigger, because this had been 4 years and the building had been more demanding than anything he had worked on before. He had not taken a single shortcut. He had not made a single interpretive decision. Every stone was where it should be. Every measurement was correct. Every proportion was restored. St. Aldamar's Cathedral was, for the first time since sometime in the medieval period, exactly what it had been designed to be. They gathered in the nave as the light was failing, the 5 of them, and there was wine and the quiet warmth of a job finished. Lucien said a few words about what the building had given him over 4 years, and Caris said something about precision, and Matteo was unusually quiet in a way that the others attributed to the particular sadness of leaving a project. Olivier stood slightly apart from the group, with his glass, listening to the building in the way he always listened to it. Then Elias set down his wine. He said it simply, without preamble, the way a man states a fact he has been sitting with for too long. The stones feel warm, the foundation stones. He had checked before coming upstairs. They had been cold since the first week of the project. Tonight they were warm. The room went very still. Not the stillness of disbelief, the stillness of people recognizing something they have been not quite seeing for longer than they wanted to admit. Caris put down her glass and took out her phone and opened her monitoring software and turned the screen so Lucien could see it. She walked him through the numbers in a low, measured voice. 6 weeks of rotational displacement, the acceleration curve, the way the rate of change had increased in the past week, since the final course of stone was set into the western wall. The way the numbers had, in the past 48 hours, stabilized. Not because the movement had stopped, she said, because it had reached where it was going. Then Matteo went to his bag and took out his laptop and opened the folder he had not opened in front of anyone, and he put the laptop on the table where their wine glasses had been, and they looked at the photographs of the hidden fresco together. No one spoke for a while after that. Lucien studied the images for a long time. The workers carrying stone downward, not upward. Their faces. The form in the earth below the foundation line. Vast and curled and still. He looked at those faces, the painted ones. Medieval artists rendering the expressions of medieval craftsmen in the same position he was now in. People building something they had been told to build without being told what it was for. And he understood that understanding was not limited to the people in this room. Someone had known. Someone in the 12th century had known what this building was, and had hidden a record of that knowledge in the most durable medium available to them behind a layer of plaster, in the hope that it would survive until someone who needed to know was in a position to find it. He went to the archive room. He had been through those boxes dozens of times, cataloguing and organizing, and setting things aside for post-project review. He pulled the boxes he hadn't finished with. He went through them methodically, not looking for anything specific, letting the documents tell him what was there. He found the manuscript fragment in the 4th box. It was a photocopy of a page from a document that had been found in the same monastery library as the original plans, translated by a graduate student at the University of Strasbourg 3 years earlier and filed without follow-up. The translation was handwritten in the margin of the photocopy, and Lucien stood under the archive room's fluorescent light and read it twice. The manuscript dated to 1097, 31 years before construction of St. Aldamar's Cathedral began, and what it said, in the precise and slightly archaic French of the translation, was this: "To whoever inherits this knowledge, the structure whose foundations we have begun should not be completed. What was given to us by the builders of the Gallo-Roman period, who in their turn inherited it from the people before them, is not a cathedral. It was conceived as an enclosure. The proportions are not expressions of faith. They are the dimensions of a weight. What rests beneath the hill was resting there before the Carnutes came to it and before the Romans built upon it. It has been beneath this place since before our records begin. The old people built their rituals around it because they could feel it, not because they understood it. We do not understand it either. We know only that when the circle of stones is complete above it, something in the ground below stirs in response. The last time the structure was whole, in the century before the first fire, the priests who maintained it reported that the stones of the foundation were warm to the touch, and that the building itself seemed to breathe. We sealed the well and began to build the cathedral to continue the containment. But we were given this knowledge with the warning attached: do not complete it. The original builders made the design deliberately incomplete, leaving one wall unfinished as a mercy, because a complete structure does not contain the thing below. A complete structure is a signal to the thing below. Do not close the circle. Whatever is beneath this hill has been here longer than we can account for, and it has been patient in a way that nothing patient should be able to be. And if the design is completed correctly and precisely as it was originally drawn, it will know. Lucien read it a third time. Then he sat down on the floor of the archive room, which he had never done before on any project. And he sat there for a while in the particular silence of someone absorbing information that changes the shape of everything around it. When he went back to the nave, the others were still there. Olivier had not moved from where he had been standing. Lucien read the translation to them. He read it slowly and without dramatization because he was a precise person, and precision mattered to him even now, even in this. When he finished, nobody spoke, and in the quiet they all became aware, at roughly the same moment, of a sound that had not been present when he started reading. Not a sound exactly, a presence in the building's material, a resonance moving through the stone floor and the walls and the thick barrel vault above their heads, sourceless and pervasive, the way a very large bell sounds not in your ears but in your chest, not coming from any direction, coming from the building itself. Olivier set down his glass and walked to the tower stairs. He did not explain himself. They watched him go, heard him climbing, heard his footsteps cross the bell chamber above, and then silence. They stood there listening to the resonance in the walls until Olivier came back down.
No!
He stood in the archway at the bottom of the stairs and said what he had to say with the economy of a man who had spent 30 years keeping his own counsel. The bell was ringing. The oldest one, the heaviest. He had stood directly beneath it and watched the clapper for a full minute. The clapper had not moved. There was no wind in the tower. The rope was still. The bell was ringing on its own. And as though the saying of it aloud was itself a kind of signal, the bell rang again. One tone, enormous and low, rolling down through the tower and through the stone and into the floor beneath their feet. And from below the crypt, from below the foundation, from somewhere that no plan of this building had ever acknowledged, something answered it. Not with a bell tone, not with any sound that any of them had a word for. A pulse, a resonance deep enough to feel in the fillings of your teeth and the fluid of your inner ear. Felt before it was heard, the way the footfall of a very large animal is felt before it is heard. A single throb of presence, enormous and slow, and entirely without urgency, the way something breathes when it has no reason to hurry. Then, quiet. Then, the resonance in the walls. Steady and low, like a building that has remembered how to hum. They went down together. This was Lucien's decision, and he will tell you he doesn't entirely understand why he made it. He will use the word necessary. He will say it felt like the difference between knowing something and understanding it, and that he had spent his whole career in the business of understanding things rather than just knowing them, and that some part of him was constitutionally incapable of stopping short of the bottom. He took a flashlight. The others took whatever light was available. Olivier took nothing, said he didn't need it, and walked at the back of the group with the unhurried confidence of someone entering a familiar room. They went through the nave and down the crypt stairs and along the crypt gallery to the northwest corner, and they stood in front of the wall. Elias went to it first. He pressed both palms flat against the surface and closed his eyes and stood there for 10 seconds. When he opened his eyes, he looked at Lucien with an expression that contained no surprise at all. The wall was warm. They took it apart by hand. 5 people pulling stone and crumbling mortar in a 900-year-old crypt by flashlight and phone light, and the mortar came away with a readiness that none of them remarked on, because they were each engaged in the private process of not thinking too carefully about what the readiness meant. The wall came down in less than 2 hours. Behind it, a staircase. 32 steps cut from black granite that matched nothing else in the cathedral's construction. a different stone entirely from the sandstone of the walls and the limestone of the carved elements above. Older. The steps were worn smooth in a way that required centuries of use, not decades, a gentle concave curve at the center of each tread. The cumulative weight of every foot that had descended these stairs before anyone currently living was born. The air that rose from below when the wall came down was dry and absolutely still, in the way of air that has been sealed in a space with no movement for a very long time. Not damp, not cold, and carrying a smell that none of them could name with confidence. Something below the register of earth and stone. Something that had been present at the bottom of that space for long enough that it had become the smell of the space itself. They went down. The chamber at the bottom was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, the walls of the same black granite as the steps. The ceiling was low enough that Lucien, who was not a tall man, instinctively ducked when he entered. The floor was perfectly flat, dressed to a smoothness that must have taken weeks of labour in the 12th century, and when Lucien crouched and pressed his hand against it, he felt what Elias had been feeling in the foundation stones for over a year. Warmth. Deep, dry, steady warmth, coming up through the stone from below, exactly as though something beneath the floor had been radiating heat for a very long time. In the centre of the chamber, a stone altar, a flat slab of dark granite on 4 carved legs, each leg incised with markings that were not Latin, not any script Lucien recognised, the kind of writing that predated the writing systems he knew by a span of time he was not comfortable estimating. The altar surface itself was bare of any decoration, except for one thing, set into the stone near its centre, mounted in a small iron fitting that had been attached to the granite with a craftsmanship so precise it had not shifted in 9 centuries. An iron lock. The lock was old, dark with age, furred with rust at its edges, the iron pitted and scarred by centuries of damp. Except that when Lucien knelt and brought his flashlight close to the mechanism, the light fell on the latch and showed him what he had dreaded seeing since the moment he first stepped into the chamber. The latch had been recently moved. The rust over the mechanism was scratched through in bright lines, the exposed metal gleaming where the corrosion had been broken away. The scratches were fresh, weeks old at most. Someone had taken a key to this lock within the past month and opened it. The team had been the only people in this building for 4 years. No one spoke. They had passed the point where speech felt like an adequate response to what they were encountering. They stood in that chamber and they listened, and what they listened to, after a while, was each other's breathing and the steady, low resonance moving through the walls, which was louder here, and the warmth coming up through the stone floor, and the absolute patience of the room itself. Matteo went to the wall. He pressed his ear against the black granite the way a doctor presses a stethoscope against the chest, and he stood that way for 30 seconds while the others watched him. When he stepped back, his face was composed in the way of someone who has just confirmed a diagnosis. Something was breathing, he said, through the stone, long and slow, each breath taking something like 30 seconds, from inhalation to exhalation, deeply regular, the rhythm of something that had been breathing that way for so long it no longer needed to think about it, the way very old people sometimes breathe in deep sleep, each breath enormous and complete, and requiring no more effort than the previous one. Something very large, he said. Below us, Caris checked her sensors. The rotational movement in the foundation had stopped. She stared at the readings for a long time, because what she was seeing was not the cessation of movement, but the arrival of it. Whatever was being aligned over the 6 weeks she had been recording it had reached its alignment. The wheel had come to rest exactly where it needed to rest. They stood in that chamber for a long time. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. Nothing reached toward them or acknowledged them in any way. The warmth continued. The breathing continued. The resonance in the walls continued with the steadiness of something that has operated this way for a very long time and intends to continue. The horror of that, of being in a room with something that was aware at some deep level and completely indifferent to you, is not the horror of being threatened. Lucien will tell you it is the horror of scale, of understanding in the most physical and immediate way possible that you are standing next to something so ancient and so large that your entire existence, every human being who has ever lived, every year of recorded history, every empire that has risen and fallen, is contained within what this thing would experience as a brief interruption of a very long sleep. They went back upstairs. They sat in the nave and waited for the light to come back. Nobody slept. Olivier went up to the tower twice more, during the night. Both times the bell had rung and the clapper had not moved. Both times the answer came from below, that single deep pulse, and both times the resonance in the walls rose slightly afterward and then settled back to its baseline, the way a breath does after exertion. It was during that long wait that Lucien thought carefully about the lock that had been opened recently, within the past month, while the 5 of them were the only people in the building. He thought about each of his team members, one by one. He thought about whether any of them could have found that staircase before he did, found the chamber, found the altar. He thought about this for a long time and came to no conclusion, because he also thought about the other possibility, that the lock had not been opened by anyone on his team, that the lock had been opened from the inside. He did not share this thought with the others. He held it and turned it over and eventually set it aside, in the part of his mind where he put things he could not resolve, and he went back to what he could resolve, which was what had happened and what it meant. He talked for a long time as the light began to come in through the restored windows. He is a methodical person. He went through it in the order it had happened, the way you go through a building from the entrance. The Carnutes had come to this hill for 1,000 years before the Romans arrived. Every druid in Gaul once a year, for 1,000 years, making the journey to stand near whatever was in this hill, not to worship it. The druids, from everything that had been recorded about them, were not a people who worshipped things they didn't understand. They came to stand near it, to acknowledge it, to maintain through the ritual of regular visitation a relationship with something that had been in the earth at that site since before their history began. Caesar had described the Carnute sanctuary as the most important in all of Gaul, the place where disputes were settled and laws were made. You don't hold your entire civilization's most important annual gathering in a location because it is centrally located. You hold it there because the place itself lends authority, because whatever is in that place makes the decisions made near it feel like decisions made in the presence of something larger than any human court. The Romans built their own temple above the grotto when they suppressed the Carnutes, because that is what the Romans did. They did not destroy holy places, they reclaimed them. They placed their own gods over the existing sanctity and called the sanctity their own. The early Christians came and did the same thing, and for the same reasons, and built their basilica. The basilica burned, another church, another fire, and each time the building was destroyed and rebuilt, whatever was below continued to do what it had always done, which was to breathe very slowly in the dark. And then, in 1128, someone who understood the site, in a way that the previous builders had not built something different, not a temple over the grotto, not a church over the ancient well, a containment, an enclosure designed with a specificity that went beyond architecture, a structure whose function was not to honour what was below, but to press down on it, to use the weight and the geometry of the building the way a hand presses on a wound. The thick foundation walls were not structural, they were a seal. The crossing tower was not offset for aesthetic reasons. It was positioned directly above the place where the well had been filled in, directly above the chamber, because the tower's weight was part of the mechanism. The proportions of the building, which Lucien had found so specific and so unusual in the original plans, were the specific proportions of a lock, and the building had worked for 200 years until sections of it fell. And when sections of it fell, the seal was broken, and whatever was below began gradually to stir. And then, 4 years ago, Lucien Faro, who was the most precise preservation architect working in France, who had never taken a shortcut and never made an interpretive decision, and who believed with a deep conviction of a vocation that the past deserved to be remembered exactly as it was, had been hired to put every stone back. He had done this perfectly, every measurement verified, every material matched, every proportion exact. He had taken the thing that was built in 1128 as a seal and returned it, over 4 years of careful loving work, to its original form. He had done his job better than anyone could reasonably have hoped. The sun came fully through the restored windows and fell across the stone floor, in rectangles of winter light, and Lucien sat in one of those rectangles and looked at his hands. They discussed what could be done. The conversation was honest and eventually short, because there was very little to discuss. Reporting it meant explaining it to people who had not stood in that chamber, and what they had experienced was not transferable in any medium available to them. Destroying the restoration would change nothing. The manuscript had said what it said. The lock had been opened from inside, and the process of completing the circle, of whatever alignment had occurred below the foundation, was finished. You cannot unseal a thing by tearing down what you built. You can only interrupt it, the way the medieval collapses had interrupted it, and Lucien looked at that option and understood that an interruption was not a solution. It was a delay. It had been a delay for 9 centuries. There was also this: no one had been harmed. Nothing had threatened them. The thing below them, whatever it was, had not reached toward them. It had not communicated with them in any way they could pass. It had simply woken up slowly, in the way that very large things wake up slowly, and it was now awake, and it knew the circle was complete, and it breathed in the dark, below the foundation, with all the patience of something that has been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. Elias went down to the chamber at first light for the last time, and came back and reported in a quiet voice that the warmth was stronger than it had been the night before. Not dramatically, he said, but stronger, the way a fire is stronger in the morning than it was when you banked it the night before. Lucien asked him what the breathing sounded like, whether he had been able to hear it. Elias thought for a moment and said that it sounded the way a very large animal sounds when it has finished running, when it has found a warm place and settled, and let its body catch up with what it has been doing. Not distressed, not hungry, not alert, just breathing. Finally, fully, without any part of the breath being held back. Like something that had been half asleep for a very long time, Lucien said. And now is not, Elias said. The building stands. Tourists visit it in spring and summer. Mass is said on Sundays by a priest who knows what was found in the crypt and what was found in the archive room, because Lucien told him before he left. Because Lucien is a precise person who believes in accurate records. The priest listened without expression, and when Lucien finished, the priest thanked him for the restoration work and said that the building had never looked more like itself. He said this without apparent irony, and Lucien cannot decide, even now, whether the statement was ignorant or whether it was the most accurate thing anyone said throughout the entire project. The bells ring on schedule. The oldest bell rings with the others. If its tone lingers slightly longer than the physics of bronze and stone strictly require, the tourists take photographs of the vaulting, and the priest marks his place in his missal, and the sound moves through the stone walls and the stone floor, and down through the thick foundation, and down into the dark, and something receives it. And something slowly breathes back. Lucien still works. He still takes the projects no one else will take. The buildings that have waited longest. The structures that are furthest from what they were meant to be. He's more careful now, which is something people who know him thought was not possible. Before he accepts a commission, he reads everything available about the site. Not just the structure, but the site itself, the ground it stands on. What was there before? What was there before that? He looks for the discontinuities, the gaps in the record, the places where the documentation becomes cautious or stops entirely. He looks for manuscripts labelled as ecclesiastical poetry and reads them word by word. He looks for archive boxes set aside for post-project review and opens them on the first day. He has turned down 4 commissions in the past 3 years. He will not explain the reasons for declining to the people who hired him. He simply says that the work cannot proceed as described, and he returns the deposit, and he goes home. There is 1 cathedral in Germany, 1 in Belgium, and 2 in northern Spain that are now being restored by other architects. Architects who are thorough and talented, and careful in all the ways that matter in their profession. They have not found what Lucien found in the archive rooms of those buildings, but Lucien has, because Lucien looked, and what he found in each of those archive rooms told him enough that he made his decision and sent back the deposit, and went home. He does not speak about what he found in those archive rooms. He says only that there are some buildings that were built to be incomplete, and that the most dangerous person in the world when it comes to those buildings is someone who is very good at their job. He still believes that the past deserves to be remembered accurately. He will tell you that belief has not changed. He will tell you that what has changed is his understanding of what accurately means, and what it costs, and what you have to know before you decide whether the price is worth paying. The hill 2 hours north of Paris is very quiet. The tourists come in spring and summer. The priest says his mass. The bells ring on schedule. And in the chamber below the crypt, below the foundation, below the layer of black granite that marks the boundary between what was built and what was already there, something breathes in the long dark with all the patience of something that was old before the Carnutes came to stand near it, and that will be old long after the cathedral above it is dust, and that has, for the first time in 900 years, completed its sleep.